Hey there, hi everybody. Welcome to Course in Miracles Applied. Today's topic is the title is a little longer than usual. The title is "You Can't Look at Guilt from a Distance: A New Paradigm of Forgiveness." I can't but think of turning this into a rap song, but I'm not gonna do it on air. You can't look at guilt from a distance, and so on. So if you have any ideas, feel free to share. So I was thinking about what it is or what it means to look at the ego. What is it, right? It sounds reasonable and it sounds doable, but what is actually, who's looking and with what are we looking and what are we looking at when we look at the ego? So that's going to be the topic for today. And I feel like I want to share a new way, a possible new or additional way of implementing forgiveness in our lives. One that isn't coming intuitively to us. We have to kind of first overcome a little bit of resistance of doing it. It's not, it needs a little preparation, I think. So what we're reading from today is mostly chapter 11, section 5, the dynamics, in quotes, of the ego. And the first sentence is basically for me, sets the foundation for our work with the Course. He says, "No one can escape from illusions unless he looks at them, for not looking is the way they are protected." So the illusions that we want to escape from, the illusions of the ego thought system, we want to escape from them, but also there's a big part of us that wants to protect them and not want them to be looked at and undone. And Jesus says very clearly that not looking at the ego is how we protect it. So the ego protects itself in diverting our view from it. And the Course talks about mind wandering. So the mind wandering would be if we begin to look at our ego and then we wander off and think about something completely different, right? It happens to all of us. So we want to escape from illusions, but we don't know how to do it. What we intuitively do if we want to escape illusions is go toward the truth, right? We want to highlight the Holy Spirit, Jesus, God, love, oneness, Christ, and such. We kind of, by nature, want to go towards that, right? And we talked about this before. However, Jesus says you can't escape the illusion unless you look at them. In other words, you can't escape the illusion by trying to go toward truth. Right? We're on our way to truth, but the way to truth is by turning around, facing the illusion, looking at it, right? No one can escape from illusions unless he looks at them, for not looking is the way they are protected. We protect the illusions of the ego thought system. We protect our self, quote unquote, our lower S self, our self-concept. We protect that by not looking. And then Jesus says, there is no need to shrink from illusions, for they cannot be dangerous. Because from his perspective, obviously, illusions are illusions. They're not real. So if it's an illusion, we don't have to be afraid of it, right? We are ready to look more closely at the ego's thought system because together we have the lamp that will dispel it. And since you realize you do not want it, you must be ready. So we have a certain amount of readiness. It's a small readiness. That's why Jesus talks about the little willingness so often. Right? We know we don't have a big willingness, we have a small willingness, because our willingness is small because our fear is still so big. The less our fear becomes, the more willing we are to move forward. Let us be very calm in doing this, for we are merely looking honestly for truth. Right? We're looking for truth, and in order to get to the truth, we must first identify and look at the illusions. And the illusion really is the whole ego thought system, right? It starts with the tiny mad idea, then it becomes a sin. That thought of possibly being separate from God, from the ego's perspective, becomes a sin. We experience that tremendous amount of guilt that is so acute it must be projected out onto God, and then we're afraid of God in the mind, and then the ego says you can escape that fear of God, who is also in the mind with you, by fragmenting, making the world, and then finally identifying with something and someone in the world. That is the ladder of the ego separation down into the body as the final hiding place from God, from the vengeful, wrathful God as we believe he is, right? So all this is an illusion. However, we believe with every fiber of our being that it is not an illusion, but the truth. So in our mind, even though we can do the course 30, 40, 50 years, we still believe that this is not an illusion. We can say this is an illusion, but we don't believe it is an illusion. If we were seriously and completely to believe that the ego thought system is an illusion, we would automatically be here. We would look at everyone through the vision of Christ. Nobody would be excluded. There would be complete peace, a peace that we can't grasp in the state we're in right now because we're mostly connected with the ego. And on this channel, I realize that we speak a lot about guilt and the ego thought system just because of that reason, right? We cannot escape the illusions unless we look at them. And we want to dive a little bit deeper into what it means to actually look. What is it? How do we do it, right? It sounds like, okay, I can look at the ego, but what is it? Practically speaking, I'm at the register at the supermarket. What does it mean to look at the ego? Or I'm thinking about money, or I'm thinking about my health, or the political stage in the world, or in our country, or whatever it is. How do I actually look at the ego? Because if that's what the solution is, right? If Jesus says you cannot escape the illusion unless you look at them, right? For not looking is the way they're protected. You either look at them, or you either look at the ego, or you protect it. There's nothing in between. Right? We will not look at the ego if we still want to protect it. And our decision-making capabilities are very limited right now. We can't just say, oh, I'm going to go to the Holy Spirit, right? It sounds easy, and it kind of feels like the right thing to do, to go to the Holy Spirit. But first of all, we're not in contact with who is the one that's going to the Holy Spirit. And secondly, what is the Holy Spirit? How do I go there? How can I just go there? Why wouldn't I then just stay there? Right? We have to realize the illusion and why we're with the ego in the first place, the purpose of this illusion, right? Jesus could also say, and he says that in other areas in the Course, when he says no one can escape from illusions until he or she figures out the purpose of what the illusion serves. And the purpose of the illusion is to keep us from this decision-making point in our mind. Right? The ego's only goal really is for us never to come from here where we are right now. We are identified with the body in this world, how to get up here and make another choice. Right? The ego's goal is for us not to get up there, to stay here. And one way of doing this is not to look at the dynamics, quote unquote, of the ego. We protect the ego by not looking. And just like we can have a pseudo God, a pseudo Jesus, pseudo Holy Spirit that the ego gives us and feeds us, right? And we believe that's the one that we're talking to, right? We think we talk to the real Holy Spirit, but it's actually our ego just bouncing back at us in a way that we can be satisfied and don't look deeper. Right? Looking at the ego means looking at the purpose. There's nothing without purpose in this Course. Purpose is the oxygen. Right? Without oxygen, nothing goes. And if we talk about looking at the ego and we don't talk about purpose, what is the purpose of the ego in the first place? And what is the purpose of this situation I'm in right now that I need the Holy Spirit for? If we don't talk about the purpose, we're not looking. Right? We can say, I project my guilt onto my brother. I look at the guilt in my brother. That's not enough. That's good for the start. We need that beginning, that foundation that lays the groundwork from which we can then venture forward into purpose. Right? We have to realize if I project my guilt onto my brother, the purpose of it is first that the guilt is in the other person. And secondly, the purpose is that when I'm projecting my guilt onto the other person and the other person, whoever that person is, becomes responsible for how I feel, I cannot decide for the Holy Spirit because I was just, somebody made the decision for me to do something, so I get upset. The purpose of my projection is to give the responsibility for the separation to the other person. That is the purpose, right? The purpose is separation. I want to be separate from the other person, which means separate from God. I want the other person to have the guilt. And that is what I need to look at when I project onto somebody, right? Or any kind of feeling we have that isn't peaceful, right? Excitement, triumph, loss, boredom, any kind of emotions of the ego. The looking at the ego means what is the purpose of that thought, of that emotion? And the purpose is always to keep guilt outside, right? So that we're not responsible, and keep love away. That is the ultimate purpose. And how do we get to a point where we can look at the guilt into the other? So what do we do with that? What is it that we're actually doing? Because looking sounds good, but we don't know what it actually is, right? I look at the other person, I see the guilt there, but it's not really, I don't see the guilt with my eyes, right? I see the guilt with an inner awareness that reacts to what I have projected out, right? And then it kind of reflects back at me. How do I deal with that? What's the solution for it? And then he says, the dynamics, quote unquote, of the ego will be our lesson for a while. Right? That will be our lesson for a while. For a while, for Jesus, could be our lifetime, right? Our lesson with Jesus in this course, in our life, is to look at the ego. To escape from illusions by looking at them. And over the years, we learn to focus that looking, to become clearer and clearer and clearer what that looking is, and also for the time lapse between when I project something out there and I become aware of it, to shorten that time period, right? That I become aware pretty fast as to what I'm doing and how I'm feeling, and to immediately be able to realize that that's what I'm doing and what the purpose of that is. Like this prayer goes, I must have decided wrongly, for I'm not at peace. Right? That is basically the first step of looking at the ego, because we become aware that we're not feeling at peace. And that becoming aware of the ego is going to happen quicker and quicker the further we go. Which means it's not going to be easier, it's going to be harder. Whereas before we were able to project the guilt outward and have kind of like this limbo land until we like, oh, wait a minute, I'm judging this person. And the further we go, the closer we come to this judgment right after we have made it. And we realize that there's very little time we spend during the day not in here. I always say we can just by default say I'm with the ego 99.9%, right? Because I'm not worried. We don't have to worry about the part of us that is already with the Holy Spirit. That's fine. What we have to worry about is that 99% of us that wants to be with the ego. So the dynamics of the ego will be our lesson for a while, for we must first look at this to see beyond it, since you have made it real. This is one of the most important sentences when it comes to our work with the Course, right? We can't skip steps. If we go through a tragedy, or if we go through, if there was an event in our lives, and we immediately go to the Holy Spirit, we skip a whole litany of things that we'll hold on to, that we will hold on to. There's really nothing worse than being spiritual. I know it sounds funny and it sounds counterintuitive and all that, but it's really I just read that the other day, that, the wound, when you have a wound on your arm, you have to first clean it, look at it, examine it, see what's going on, expose it to the light. If we immediately put a patch on it, there might be dirt in there, it might be so deep we need stitches. If we put sage, or if we put an affirmation, or we say, oh, I'm the Holy Son of God, and put that on there, it's still there. Tranquility now, insanity later, as Seinfeld said, right? Serenity now. So the serenity now is, if we don't look, if we look beyond it, if we see a judgment, we see a person on the street and we judge, or there was an upsetting event and we're kind of still thinking about it at night, right? And we try to cover it over with spiritual self-talk. Like this is just an illusion, or nothing real can be threatened, or whatever we come up with. That's all fine and good, but the actual work is what Jesus says there, for we must look first at this to see beyond it. We cannot see beyond something until we look at it and see what its purpose is. Right? If there's an event in our lives that makes us sad, right? The purpose of the event was for us to be sad. We decided that before the event even came up. We decided I need to be sad because if I'm sad, something did that to me and I can't have the peace of God. I'm afraid of the peace of God. So for me, the best way to not have the peace of God right now is to be sad, because sadness says God is dead. God is dead. Love is dead. Love has abandoned me. Right? That's what the purpose is. So I see the purpose in the sadness. And then I wait with Jesus and look at it. And we're going to get to what that means, the looking at it. But we first must look at this to see beyond it. If we would go straight to Jesus and say, no, I'm not sad. There is no separation. This person is still with me in my heart. Minds are joined. If we mean it, that's fine. If we feel the peace of God afterwards, lasting peace, that's okay. But if we just feel a little bit better and then we go back into the sadness, back and forth for a long time, if I don't look at the cause of it, it will take longer. It is shorter. The shortest way of getting past that sadness is to straight look at it and go right into it. We must first look at this to see beyond it, since you have made it real. We have made it real already. There's this whole notion out there in the esoteric New Age spiritual world that if we look at illusions, if we look at the ego, we make it real. The truth is, we have already made it real, so real that we think we're a body. That's how real we made the ego thought system. And we can easily see that we're a body. If you would cut into your arm and it would hurt, we would know we're a body. We believe we're a body, right? So we believe we're a body because that will, we believe, save us from God in our mind. And we have made it real, right? We can't just say, oh, it's not real. Because we already have made it real. We're 100% invested. We fully believe it. So the little moment that says, oh, I'm not making it real, it's an illusion, means absolutely nothing. It's like there's a storm in the ocean. We're yelling at the storm and say, stop it. It doesn't do anything. We have made it real. So to say something, sadness, it's an illusion, I'm one with God, does not get rid of the sadness, because it does not get to the bottom of it. Because we have made sadness real, and we have made the cause for the sadness real. And we have made the purpose of the sadness real. There's a purpose in our sadness, and that's what we need to look at. And then we can look beyond it to the truth. But first we must look at it. And then Jesus says, we will undo this error quietly together. And then look beyond it to truth. So this one paragraph, it's paragraph 1 in section 5, the dynamics of the ego of chapter 11, gives us a roadmap for our work with this course and a manual to look at how to look at the ego, right? What the dynamics are. And the biggest thing is to look at it. And we'll come now to what this looking means. So in paragraph 2 he says, what is healing but the removal of all that stands in the way of knowledge? Right? That's the whole course in one sentence. As the introduction says, this is not a course on love. Right? It is on removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence. And he says the same thing here. What is healing but the removal of all that stands in the way of knowledge? So the removal is our purpose, not the holiness that is behind it. Right? The holiness needs no work. We don't need to decide for holiness. We only need to decide to have the blocks removed. And the holiness that has always been there will come back to our awareness. It's not, we don't have to go somewhere. Right? We only have to remove all that stands in the way of knowledge. It is a crucial item in the course. Jesus says, forget about me, forget about God, forget about love, forget about oneness, forget about heaven. None of that matters because that's real. Forget about yourself, your higher self, your capital S self. Forget about it. We don't have to worry about it. You can't get there right now anyway because you made the block, that removal of all that stands in the way, you made that real. So why waste time in trying to get somewhere or become aware of yourself as your capital S self? We can't become aware of our capital S self because we have made the illusion real that stands between us and our full awareness of love's presence. It's crystal clear in the course. Yes, it is much easier. It seems much easier to say, no, I'm just going to go to the Holy Spirit. I'm just going to worry about God. I'm just going to go towards God, towards love, towards oneness, towards heaven. Right? I'm going to go to my higher self and look from there back to the ego. If we could do it, we would do it. We can't go there because we have put barbed wire, grenade fences and minefields in between us and that awareness. Which means we have put guilt, mostly. The guilt is what keeps us from it. Right? The guilt is the illusion from which everything else comes. The ego thought system without guilt is nothing. So what is healing but the removal of all that stands in the way of knowledge? The removal is always about what stands in the way, which is guilt. We cannot feel whatever we feel, whatever our experience is in this world, any thoughts or feelings that we have, the cause for it is guilt. That's what stands in the way of knowledge. It is guilt. If we're sad, sadness can only come from guilt. We believe we destroyed the oneness of heaven. That guilt is so overwhelming that we turn it into sadness. And the sadness says, yes, the separation from God is actually true. And not only is it true, it's your fault. Right? No one weeps but for his innocence. No one weeps but for his innocence, as Jesus says. So none of the feelings and emotions and thoughts we have in this world have any other cause other than guilt. And guilt is what basically, that is the glue that holds the ego thought system together. Without guilt, the ego would completely dissolve. Guilt is what has driven us insane, and guilt is what hides the Father from us, right? So guilt is the block. Guilt is what stands in the way of knowledge. And if we look at this first paragraph and we exchange illusions with guilt, we read, no one can escape from guilt unless he looks at it. For not looking is the way it is protected. Right? The ego wants to protect our guilt by not looking. It says, no, go right to the Holy Spirit. Go to Jesus. Go to stay with God. We can't stay with God as we know ourselves. Right? As we know ourselves is the separated individual that is completely identified with the body as this, as such. We can't stay with God. We have no concept of God. We don't know how to get there. We don't know what it is. We don't know who we are, right? But it sounds good. It sounds like, oh yeah, I can go with God. But what the goal of the ego is for us not to look at it, at the guilt. The ego's number one goal is for us to not look at the guilt, because guilt is what stands in the way of knowledge. Guilt is in the way of us going from here to the decision maker and make a choice for the Holy Spirit. Right? This is what stands in the way, and the cause of all of this is the belief in sin, which is the guilt. This is the same, right? So the ego does not want us to look at it. The ego says, go to the Holy Spirit, go to Jesus. It uses this course for us to stay where we are. That's why Jesus says, and the new book that came out from Ken, that guilt, he says, guilt is the core of the curriculum of the course. The core. Not love, not oneness, not some lofty space that we're looking down. Guilt is the key, is the door to truth. And then he says, and how else can one dispel illusions except by looking at them directly without protecting them? So he repeats the same one in the first one. Be not afraid, therefore, for what you will be looking at is the source of fear, and you are beginning to learn that fear is not real. For what you will be looking at is the source of fear. The source of fear is guilt. Guilt projected onto God makes us afraid of God. So it's very clear dynamic that guilt is the source of fear within us. Guilt is the source then of the fragmentation, of making of the world, and of the identification with the body and the world. What we will be looking at is the source of fear. Now it becomes clear why we're not looking. We don't want to get in touch with that fear. Right? It's very normal not to want to look. That's why it takes a long time. It takes preparation. It takes this relationship, that budding relationship with Jesus or the Holy Spirit, however ill-fated it was in the past, right? We used Jesus for parking spaces and to get money or whatever we did relationships. I mean, we've been through it, right? And eventually we come to this point and say, okay, let's start the work, which is looking at the guilt that we have denied and that we want to protect. Because without guilt, there is no ego thought system, there is no individual existence. There's just a choice for God. And that's no longer a choice, right? once we're past the guilt, the choice, really, the only choice we can make is to look at the guilt. Once the guilt is gone, we will automatically, the attraction of God will pull us back. That's what Jesus means when he says God will take the last step. God isn't taking the last step. It's not like, okay, I'll pull you up now. The attraction of God, once the attraction of guilt is gone, the attraction of God will pull us in automatically. Once the obstacles have been removed, we will automatically float towards the light and realize we are the light. Right? So we always have to be concentrating on the block. And I feel like this channel is kind of it's like a tiny, I always feel like it's a tiny little step on the ladder, and the name on the ladder is called guilt. Right? That's the one step that I think for me has crystallized out that is what we need to really look at, because everything else happens by itself. If we try to skip it, it'll pull us back and we don't even know what's happening. So, having said all that, so how do we look at guilt, right? It's weird. So, this is not for the faint of heart. This needs some preparation. I don't think you can start out this process and just go straight there. That doesn't mean you have to do the course for a long time, but I think it means that you're kind of at that point where you're ready to say, you know what, I want to go to the next step, right? That's why it's called the new paradigm, the new paradigm of forgiveness. So there is this thing that's clear where we say, okay, I projected my guilt onto my brother, and I can look at that guilt and say, please, Jesus, look at this guilt with me, right? I think the ego still has a good amount of control over that looking. That's why that sentence in the beginning, the rap song, we can't look at guilt from a distance. We got to get real up close, right? We can't look at guilt from a distance. We can't really say, I'm looking at my brother and I see the guilt in him or her. Help me look at that. This might still be a little far away. And bringing it back, what does that even mean, right? Bring back the guilt to me. So my suggestion is, with any emotion, let's start with this example that we say, we become aware that we have judged another person. We're aware of the judgment. We're most likely not aware of the guilt, right? We see the responsibility in the outside person. We can't stand that person, or we want to cross the road, or we don't want to answer the call, but we're not necessarily aware of the guilt. And now we're coming to a function the Holy Spirit has that we're not utilizing. We can ask the Holy Spirit now and say, please show me the guilt within me that makes me see it on the outside. And then we wait. So we don't worry about trying to see the Christ in them, for example, right? Or forgiving them. It's completely unimportant. What's important is our own belief in guilt. We made it so real that for us, it's real and it has real consequences. So we want to ask the Holy Spirit or Jesus to show us that guilt within ourselves. And stay there. If we can stay 1 minute, if we can stay 5 minutes, that's the whole reason for the workbook, is for us to train our minds to focus enough and say, okay, please show me the guilt that is behind that attack, that I just attacked this person, I just judged that person at the register. Please show me the guilt that is within me so we can look at it together. That's one example, right? So we ask the Holy Spirit to show us that guilt. That requires the willingness from us to look at it within ourselves. The whole reason why we projected it out was because we're so afraid that if we have the guilt, God will come in and punish us and take the life back that we stole from him. That's why we project in the first place. It's not just because we're having fun, right? We're projecting the guilt out onto the other person because we believe literally that we will be saved if the other one is guilty and we're innocent. So to ask the Holy Spirit to show us the guilt that we have projected out within ourselves and then stay with us to look at it, it takes some courage. It's like a 30-foot diving board. Because we don't want to get close to that guilt. We want to skip over and just go to the Holy Spirit. I don't want to deal with the guilt at all. I'm just going to go to the Holy Spirit, right? In this new paradigm, I think Jesus asks us at some point in the process, whenever that is, for everybody, for all of us, he says, okay, let's start that very specific teaching that I'm going to give you. Whenever you feel anything that isn't peaceful, right? Let's say the sadness, let's say somebody is sad about something or is grieving, right? Somebody's grieving. To ask the Holy Spirit, because there is no grieving without guilt. We cannot grieve a loss without feeling guilty. There is no such thing. There's always, the cause is always our belief in guilt. So if we can, and we're having trouble, I mean, I went through that. We're having trouble grasping, first of all, why that loss, why does it happen to me? It's so strong. We can't possibly realize that we're doing it. Right? And then to ask the Holy Spirit to please show me the guilt that is within me that caused this. And look at it with me. Look at it together. Stay with me. And then staying with that feeling that then slowly emerges. Might not be that day, might not be that month. Right? If we're working on one issue, we can have a little time, a couple of minutes a day, and feel that sadness and that whatever that feeling is, and ask the Holy Spirit to please show us the guilt that is the cause. And that's the way we can heal it, right? To stay with the pain, not for hours and hours at a time. That would also be an ego device. to say, you want to look at your guilt? I'm going to give you guilt. You're going to wallow in it for days and days on end. That's not what that is, right? We go about our day. We sit in the subway. We have 2 minutes where we close our eyes and say, okay, how do I feel right now? I feel elated. I feel lost. I feel whatever it is. And we ask the Holy Spirit, please show me the guilt that is behind that, and look at it with me. And if we can make this into a practice over the next couple of years, we will be at the core of this paragraph. We're no longer protecting the illusion, which is guilt. We're no longer protecting it. We're not shrinking from the illusion, right? This guilt cannot be dangerous. The guilt is only dangerous if we cloak it with another feeling like sadness, grief, upset, jealousy, triumph, right? Whatever it is, we're cloaking it with something else because we believe it is dangerous. Once we take that away and say, no, it's none of those things, Jesus, Holy Spirit, please show me the guilt that is behind that emotion, behind that thought of loss, of this deep upset and anger and hatred. Show me the guilt that is the cause of it. And then we sit with it very gently with ourselves. Right? When he says, we will do this error, we will undo this error quietly together, and then look beyond it to the truth. We will undo this error quietly together. We ask Jesus to look at this, the guilt that is the cause of that feeling. Please show us that guilt, and we will look at this, undo this error, this belief in guilt quietly together. Because for Jesus, we never left him, right? We never left him. So for him, there cannot be any guilt. It's not real, because the cause for it, the separation from his love, cannot happen. It can only happen in dreams. And this dream of leaving God, we made so real. We made it so real that this is now our reality. And the guilt is the direct consequence of it. And then we hide that guilt in many, many other expressions of that same guilt, right? We deal with loss, or we deal with anger, with hatred, or with jealousy and upset. We deal with being a second-class citizen or not getting anywhere in life. Right? If we can, whatever problems we have, it is completely inconsequential what the problem is. Because the problem is an illusion, a protection device over what is the actual problem, which is always our guilt, belief in guilt. So if we look at the problem and say, Jesus, Holy Spirit, please show me the guilt that is behind it so I can heal it together with you. That would be the way. And when Jesus says the dynamic of the ego will be our lesson for a while, that is that lesson. That's the dynamic of the ego. The dynamic of the ego is we believe in guilt, and then we camouflage it with a third party thought or feeling. Which is twice removed from reality. The first removal is the guilt. The second removal is that emotion that we think we now feel, right? We feel hatred against a political figure, right? Or we feel very upset about the current events, right? If we can ask the Holy Spirit not to see the light in anything, that does not do anything at all, The ego wants to send light because the ego wants to protect the guilt from ever being exposed. So if we're sad about, or if we're upset about the current political events or whatever it is in our lives, we can ask Jesus or the Holy Spirit to show us when we're ready, very gently, the guilt that is the cause of it. And that part of it is not a happy rung of the ladder. It's not a pretty, like, oh, I look forward to looking at my guilt, right? Who does that? It's not something to look forward to. What you look forward to is what's behind it, right? And then look beyond it to truth. That is the only function Jesus or the Holy Spirit have in our lives. Whatever other function we have given them in the past were only there so they could bring us to this very moment. If you're listening to this YouTube channel, if you're watching right now, sorry, you're ready. You would not watch it if you wouldn't be ready. Right? You might say, oh, no, I don't. We come back next year, right? But the goal is now we realize, right? You realize that that's the work. There's no other work other than looking at the illusions so that we can go past them to the truth. There is no other work. Everything else is fluff. Everything else is our fear of actually doing it. We're going, oh no, I'm going to go there for a while, right? I'm going to see what Buddhism has to say. Or maybe I'll do some Reiki or Bach flowers. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's not bad. The dynamics of the ego, though, are our lesson for a while. As Jesus says in this course that we're reading it. We're committing our lives to it. Right? Once we're ready, once we're at this very moment right now, at this point where we can maybe say, I know it's uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable. This is not something like, oh yeah, I'm past the 20 years. This is nothing. This is now for me. Right? So we're in this together to ask the Holy Spirit for the guilt behind a feeling or a thought or a problem we're having in the world. And gently look at it together without protecting it. Be not afraid, therefore, as we said, for what you will be looking at is the source of fear. We will be looking in the cave at the mouth of the dragon. And we have no sword. Right? Because if we would have a sword and if we would use the sword, the dragon would become real. If we stand there, let the flames engulf us, grab Jesus' hand, after a while, however long that while is for each of us, the dragon will no longer be there when we open our eyes. Right? The dragon's the guilt. The fear of God, the last obstacle to peace, dissolves when the guilt is gone. All of our problems in this world dissolve when the guilt is gone. There's no more loss, there's no more upset, there's no more anger, there's no more jealousy, there's no more conflict or heated discussions or boredom. When the guilt is gone, the cause for all of them is gone. paragraph 9. It's kind of a little bit of a closing, but we have talked a lot about paragraph 9 in the segment called The Many Forms of Fear, or sometimes I think it's just called Fear, and then one of the subsections is called The Many Forms of Fear. And it says the ego can and does allow you to regard yourself as supercilious, unbelieving, lighthearted, distant, emotionally shallow, callous, uninvolved, and even desperate, but not really afraid. Right? The ego wants us to not feel that fear, because the fear leads us directly to the guilt, which is right below that fear. Right? And that protection of the guilt is fear, and the fear is protected by all those different emotions. And if we feel any of those emotions, if we feel emotionally shallow, right, we become aware of, like, I don't care about this person at all. If we can stop it, stop right there. I gotta know right now, right? Jesus asks. If we stop at that moment and realize the emotional shallowness and ask the Holy Spirit to see the guilt behind it, because without guilt there would not be emotional shallowness. If we can ask the Holy Spirit to wait with us and show us that guilt, and that's a true experience of guilt. That's not just a theoretical exercise. This will get us in touch over time with that guilt. And if we're starting to feel it, we feel maybe shame, or we feel like a second-class citizen, or we feel some guilt towards a person, that's that guilt. That's a reflection of that guilt. And we can look at that and say, please, Jesus, stay with me now. I want this healed, right? And sit with it for a little bit, for a minute or two. That's what looking is, right? To experience it again. Not from a distance, but within ourselves, in a gentle way. I think that was it. All right. Good luck. I'll see you on the other side.